The sky above the prairie was not blue. It was the color of molten lead, a heavy vault that seemed to crush the small caravan of wagons crawling toward the setting sun. Martha Silks, who had not yet become Mattie in the mouths of every man in Colorado, sat on the bench of a lead wagon with her back ironed straight, ignoring the sharp ache in her spine. She was only 19, but her eyes, a sharp, hawk-like hazel, had already seen enough misery to fill 3 lifetimes and a dozen graveyards. She wasn't fleeing the law. She was fleeing the suffocating ghost of anonymity. Back in Indiana, her life had been measured in the scent of lye soap and the back-breaking labor of her father's farm. A man whose only form of communication was a cracked leather belt. When she left, she took no mementos, no locks of hair or pressed flowers. She took a Sunday dress, a razor-sharp skinning knife hidden in her boot, and an absolute, unshakable conviction that the world owed her a debt it hadn't yet paid. The trail to Kansas had been a masterclass in the geography of human desperation. There, on the rutted tracks beaten by heavy ox carts, Martha learned the first law of the frontier. Morality is a luxury afforded only to those with a full stomach. In the railhead towns that sprouted like poisonous mushrooms overnight, she watched women sell themselves for a tin of peaches or the flimsy protection of a drunken deputy. But Mattie was a student of power, not just survival. If she was to put a price on her skin, that price would be one that made bankers tremble and senators stammer. By 1865, Kansas was a hornet's nest of Civil War veterans, men with shattered minds and pockets heavy with back pay. Martha shortened her name. Mattie sounded sweeter, more approachable, like a secret whispered in the dark of a noisy saloon. She settled in Abilene, a town where the dust kicked up by the great Texas cattle drives was so thick the sun looked like a pale, dying ember. It was there she met her first mentor, a woman known only as Madame Colette, who ran a makeshift establishment built of raw, bleeding pine boards. Colette was a massive woman with fingers encrusted in fake gold rings, and she gave Mattie the second lesson of the West. "Little bird," she had said, her voice a gravelly rasp, "a man does not pay for sex. Sex is everywhere, free as the dirt under a wagon wheel. A man pays to forget who he is. He pays for the illusion that, for 1 hour, he is the only hero in a world of cowards. If you learn to sell illusions, you will own the world." Mattie learned with a speed that bordered on the predatory. She learned how to listen to miners' tall tales of silver veins that didn't exist, how to laugh at the stale jokes of lonely cowboys, and how to keep her own mind crystal clear while everyone around her drowned in rot-gut whiskey. But above all, she learned the language of steel. In Abilene, a pretty smile got you into the room, but a revolver got you out of it alive. One Tuesday night in a humid November, a violent patron, a cattle baron who had lost his pride at the poker table, tried to strike one of the newer girls. Mattie didn't scream for the sheriff. She drew her skinning knife and, with a clinical precision she had practiced on sides of beef in the kitchen, she notched the man's cheek. She left a jagged mark that would remind him for the rest of his days that Mattie Silks was not a piece of property. "Next time," she whispered as the man bled onto the sawdust floor, "I'll aim for the throat. Get out and don't come back unless your pockets are bursting with gold and your manners belong to a gentleman." That was the moment Mattie realized she was done working for others. She wanted her own kingdom. In 1876, the rumors of silver in the Rockies reached Kansas like a siren song. Denver was transforming from a dusty outpost into a metropolis of vice and sudden violent wealth. Mattie gathered her savings, every dollar painstakingly sewn into the lining of her traveling cloak, and boarded the first train west. Denver was a chaotic sprawl of scaffolding, mud, and ambition. Brick buildings rose alongside canvas tents, and the rhythmic thud of hammers never stopped, day or night. It was a city in its infancy, raw and screaming for someone to organize its desires. It was perfect. Here, where the law was more of a suggestion than a reality, Mattie Silks would become the queen. She opened her first house on Market Street, a thoroughfare that would soon become synonymous with the red light infamy of the West. It wasn't yet the palace of mirrors she envisioned, but it was immaculate. Her girls were forbidden from drinking on the job. They were required to bathe daily, a luxury unheard of in those rugged times, and they were tutored in politics, poetry, and the shifting prices of the stock market. Mattie understood that the nouveau riche of Denver, the men who owned the silver mines, were bored with common bawds. They wanted refined companionship. They wanted women who could debate the merits of the railroad while emptying their wallets. But even a queen of diamonds has a flaw in her deck. Mattie's heart, otherwise a cold engine of commerce, had one singular weakness: Court Thompson. Court was everything a pragmatic businesswoman like Mattie should have avoided. He was a gambler with a dubious reputation, a man who could charm a bird off a branch and then shoot it for sport. He was a sporting man, a gunfighter with a crooked smile and a gaze that seemed to see right through Mattie's armor. He had broad shoulders, a perfectly groomed black mustache, and a habit of spending every cent he had before he even earned it. They met in a gambling den where Court had just been accused of holding an extra ace. Mattie, watching from the bar, saw Court place his hand on his pistol grip with a lazy, terrifying elegance. "Gentlemen," he had said, his voice as smooth as aged bourbon, "that ace was there because Lady Luck loves me. If you insist on insulting her, we shall have to let the lead decide who is telling the truth." Mattie intervened, not out of pity, but out of an instinct she couldn't name. "He's with me," she lied, stepping into the golden circle of the lamplight. "And if he says Luck loves him, who am I to argue with a lady as fickle as fortune?" That lie was the foundation of a bond that would span decades, a relationship defined by explosive passion, bitter betrayals, and a strange, warped loyalty that defied all logic. Court became her protector in name, though everyone in Denver knew that Mattie was the one who paid his gambling debts and bailed him out of the territorial jail. As Mattie's fortune grew, so did her legendary status. She was no longer just a madam, she was a fixture of the city. She rode through the streets of Denver in a carriage pulled by matched black horses, wearing silks that cost more than a miner earned in a decade. She was a philanthropist to the churches, who took her money secretly, and a savior to the poor. But success in the West was a target on one's back. In the shadows of the lower end of Market Street, another woman was watching. Katie Fulton lacked Mattie's refinement and her icy intellect, but she possessed a raw, feral cruelty. Katie ran a rival house, a dark, grimy hole where the whiskey was watered down and the girls were treated like cattle. She hated Mattie Silks with a burning, obsessive passion. She hated the silk dresses, the black horses, and most of all, she hated the way the city's elite looked at Mattie with a twisted kind of respect. The tension between the two queens of the night began to simmer and boil during the scorching summer of 1877. Denver was under pressure. Labor strikes in the silver mines, bloody brawls between rival unions, and a heatwave that turned the city into a tinderbox made everyone's nerves fray. One wrong look was enough to start a riot. And that wrong look came, predictably, because of Court Thompson. Court, in his reckless vanity, had begun visiting Katie Fulton's parlor, partly out of boredom and partly to prove to Mattie that he could not be tamed. When the news reached Mattie, she didn't scream or break the crystal decanters in her office. She simply sat at her mahogany desk, took her nickel-plated Colt from the drawer, and checked the cylinder with a sharp metallic click. "Where are you going, madame?" one of her girls asked, trembling at the sight of the unnatural paleness of Mattie's face. Mattie looked in the gold-framed mirror, adjusted a stray lock of hair beneath her black hat adorned with ostrich plumes, and replied in a voice that seemed to drop the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. "I am going to put an end to a joke that has gone on far too long. Denver will learn today that the Queen of Diamonds does not share her throne." When her carriage reached the banks of Cherry Creek, the sun was beginning to dip behind the peaks, casting long purple shadows over the city. The word had spread like wildfire. Hundreds of spectators had gathered along the muddy banks, keeping a respectful distance. Gunfights between men were a daily occurrence, but a formal duel between two madams was something the frontier had never witnessed. Katie Fulton was already there, her feet planted wide in the dirt, wearing a dress of cheap, gaudy satin that looked vulgar in the fading light. In her hand she clutched a heavy .44 caliber revolver that looked far too large for her stubby fingers. Beside her, Court Thompson leaned against a cottonwood tree, his expression a mix of smug amusement and burgeoning panic. He liked being the prize, but he was starting to realize that his game might end in the death of the only woman who truly saw him for what he was. Mattie stepped down from her carriage with a regal, measured grace, She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't even acknowledge Court. Her entire world was narrowed down to the woman standing 30 paces away. "Katie," Mattie said, her voice carried by the cold breeze blowing down from the stankosi. "You wanted my attention. You have it. I hope you're prepared to pay the price for it." Here is part 2 of the epic of Mattie Silks. This section dives into the legendary duel, the architectural marvel of her empire, and the complex psychological warfare of the Denver underworld. The air at Cherry Creek was thick with the smell of stagnant water and the electric tension of a gathering storm. The crowd held its breath, a sea of grime-streaked faces, miners, merchants, and gamblers, all witnessing a moment that would be whispered about in every saloon from Cheyenne to El Paso. Katie Fulton's hand was shaking. The heavy .44 was a man's weapon, clumsy and brutal. Mattie, however, held her nickel-plated Colt with the casual familiarity of a card player holding a winning hand. "On the count of 3, shouted a self-appointed referee, a local gambler who had seen enough blood to be indifferent to it. 1. Katie's breathing was ragged, her face flushed with a mixture of hatred and terror. 2. Mattie didn't blink. She fixed her gaze on the center of Katie's chest, her mind a cold room where emotion was locked away. 3. A double crack shattered the evening silence. 2 plumes of white, acrid smoke rose into the twilight. For a heartbeat, neither woman moved. Then, a gasp rippled through the crowd. Katie Fulton gasped, her pistol slipping from her fingers as she clutched her shoulder, crimson bloom spreading across her yellow satin dress. She had missed wildly, her bullet thudding into the dirt yards away from Mattie. But Mattie wasn't looking at Katie. She was looking at Court Thompson. A low moan came from the man leaning against the cottonwood tree. Court's hand was pressed to his side, his face draining of color. In the chaos and the bad light, Mattie's bullet, or perhaps a ricochet, had struck the very man they were fighting over. It was a poetic irony that the frontier would never forget. The prize of the duel was the only one truly wounded by it. Mattie didn't run to him. She didn't scream. She simply holstered her weapon, turned her back on the bleeding man and her sobbing rival, and walked back to her carriage. "Take me home," she told the driver. "I have a palace to build." The scandal of the duel only served to catapult Mattie into a new stratosphere of fame. She used the notoriety to secure loans that no other woman could dream of. She wasn't just a madam anymore. She was a brand, and her masterpiece was about to rise. The House of Mirrors. Located at 1942 Market Street, the House of Mirrors was unlike anything the West had ever seen. While other bordellos were dark, cramped affairs smelling of cheap whiskey and unwashed bodies, Mattie's establishment was a temple of light. She spent a fortune on floor-to-ceiling mirrors imported from Italy, framed in ornate gold leaf. The logic was cold and brilliant. In a room full of mirrors, no one could sneak up on a man. It provided a sense of security to the powerful men, judges, railroad magnates, and senators, who walked through her doors. The grand parlor featured a massive chandelier made of bohemian crystal that turned the light of 100 candles into a dazzling spray of diamonds. The furniture was carved from dark mahogany, and the walls were adorned with velvet tapestries. But the real attraction was the Silks girls. Mattie ran her house with the discipline of a Prussian general. Her girls were dressed in the finest silks, hence her name, many whispered, though she had carried it long before. They were taught to play the piano, to speak of the gold standard, and to provide the one thing men in the West lacked most, the feeling of being civilized. By 1880, Mattie Silks was the unofficial queen of Denver. She owned racehorses that won at every track in the territory. She owned blocks of real estate. When the city's elite held balls, they pretended she didn't exist. But when their sons got into trouble or their banks needed a silent partner for a risky venture, they found their way to the House of Mirrors after midnight. Yet the ghost of Court Thompson still haunted her halls. He had survived the shooting, and despite his betrayal, Mattie took him back. He became her cross to bear. He drank her finest champagne, lost her money at the faro tables, and grew increasingly resentful of the woman who held the purse strings. One night, in the private quarters of the House of Mirrors, the tension finally snapped. Court, drunk and bellicose, threw a crystal glass against one of the great mirrors. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the house like a gunshot. "You think you're better than me because you have the gold," Court roared, his eyes bloodshot. "But you're just a harlot in a fancy dress, Mattie. Without me, you're nothing but a target." Mattie stood by the fireplace, her silhouette reflected a dozen times in the remaining mirrors. She looked at the man she had loved, the man she had bled for, and felt a profound, hollow stillness. "Court," she said, her voice barely a whisper but cutting through his rage like a razor. "I built this world while you were sleeping off benders. I am the one who keeps the wolves from your door. If you ever break another glass in my house, I won't aim for your side next time. I'll aim for the heart I was foolish enough to think you had." She kicked him out that night, but like a moth to a flame, he returned. Their cycle of violence and passion became the dark heartbeat of the House of Mirrors. As the 1880s progressed, Denver began to change. The wild was being bled out of the West. The arrival of more respectable women from the East brought a new wave of morality that viewed Market Street not as a necessary evil, but as a plague to be eradicated. Reformers began to march. The police, who had once been on Mattie's payroll, started to feel the pressure of the ballot box. Mattie saw the writing on the wall. She wasn't a woman to be caught unaware. While other madams spent their earnings on jewelry and opium, Mattie invested in the one thing that never went out of style: land. She bought ranches in the high country, sensing that the era of the parlor house was drawing to a close, but she wasn't ready to give up her crown just yet. In 1885, a new challenge arrived in the form of a young, ambitious district attorney who vowed to clean up the sinks of iniquity in Denver. He targeted the House of Mirrors first, believing that if he could topple Mattie Silks, the rest of Market Street would crumble. He sent agents to infiltrate her house, looking for evidence of stolen goods or illegal gambling. But Mattie was steps ahead. She had a network of spies that rivaled the Pinkertons. Every time a raid was planned, she knew about it hours in advance. The police would burst through the doors only to find her girls reading poetry, the bar serving nothing but tea, and Mattie herself sitting at her desk, impeccably dressed, offering the officers a tray of biscuits. "Is there something I can help you with, gentlemen?" she would ask with a sardonic smile. "Or have you simply come to admire the decor?" She was winning the war, but the cost was high. Court's health was failing, and her own soul was weary of the constant battle. The mirrors in her house, once symbols of her power, now seemed to reflect only the lines around her eyes and the coldness of her solitude. One evening, a young girl, no older than 16, arrived at her door. She was shivering, her clothes rags, her eyes filled with the same desperate hunger Mattie had felt on the trail from Indiana 20 years before. "I want to be like you," the girl whispered. "I want to be a queen." Mattie looked at the girl, then at the glittering, cold perfection of the House of Mirrors. She saw the shattered glass of her own youth reflected in the girl's eyes. "Being a queen in this town, child, means you have to be comfortable living in a palace made of ice," Mattie said, her voice unusually soft. "You have to be prepared to never be loved, only envied. You have to be prepared to carry a gun in your silk garter and a stone in your chest where your heart used to be. Is that the life you want?" The girl hesitated, and in that hesitation, Mattie saw the truth. The West was no longer a place for dreams. It was becoming a place for shadows. Here is part 3, the final and most expansive chapter of the Mattie Silks saga. This section is designed to be a sweeping, atmospheric conclusion, rich in historical detail and emotional depth to ensure we maximize the length and impact of the narrative. The decade of the 1890s arrived not with a celebratory roar, but with the ominous tolling of a funeral bell for the Old West. The panic of 1893 struck the silver markets like a thunderbolt from a vengeful god, and Denver, the city built on the shimmering promise of the mines, felt its foundations tremble. Banks shuttered their doors, silver barons became paupers overnight, and the once boisterous streets of Market Street grew quiet, haunted by the ghosts of a prosperity that had vanished into the thin mountain air. Mattie Silks stood at the mahogany balcony of the House of Mirrors, watching the transition of an era. The scent of wood smoke and horse manure was being replaced by the acrid metallic tang of coal smoke and the first sputtering fumes of internal combustion engines. The world was shrinking. The vast, lawless horizon that had greeted her as a 19-year-old girl was being fenced in by telegraph wires and the suffocating grip of Eastern morality. For Mattie, the struggle was no longer about expanding her empire. It was about holding on to the fragments of a crumbling reality. The moral purity leagues had gained a foothold in the city council, and the new Denver was a place of hypocritical shadows. Men who had spent their youth carousing in her parlor now sat in pews, voting for ordinances that would criminalize the very women who had kept their secrets for a generation. But the greatest blow to Mattie's iron resolve didn't come from the law, but from the one man she could never truly quit. Court Thompson was dying. The years of hard whiskey, gambling hall brawls, and the lingering lead from that fateful day at Cherry Creek had finally caught up with him. He was a hollowed-out version of the charming rogue she had loved, his skin the color of old parchment, and his voice a raspy shadow of its former self. Mattie became his nurse, his shield, and his jailer. She moved him into a quiet room at the back of the house, away from the glittering mirrors and the tinkling of the piano. She spent thousands of dollars on the best doctors from Chicago and St. Louis, but even her gold couldn't bribe the Reaper. In his final hours, Court reached out and took her hand. His grip was weak, but his eyes, for a brief second, regained that old mischievous spark. "Mattie," he whispered, "we gave them a hell of a show, didn't we?" "The best Denver ever saw, Court," she replied, her voice steady even as her heart felt like it was being crushed by a weight she couldn't name. Don't let them turn you into a statue, Mattie. Stay real. Stay silk." When he breathed his last, Mattie didn't go into mourning. She didn't wear a veil or wail at the graveside. She paid for the most expensive casket in the state, bought a plot of land that overlooked the city, and stood alone as the dirt was shoveled over the only man who had ever dared to treat her as an equal. When she returned to the House of Mirrors that night, she did something she had never done. She ordered the great chandelier to be extinguished and sat in the dark for 3 days. The turn of the century brought the ultimate challenge. In 1911, the city of Denver finally passed the red light law, effectively outlawing the parlor houses of Market Street. The police, no longer willing to take her contributions, arrived with padlocks and eviction notices. Mattie Silks did not plead. She did not cry. She met the chief of police at the door, dressed in a gown of midnight blue, her diamonds catching the afternoon sun. "You're late, Arthur," she said to the man whose father's gambling debts she had once forgiven. "I've already packed the silver." She sold the House of Mirrors for a fraction of its value, but she was far from destitute. The ranches she had bought in the 80s were now prime real estate. She moved to a modest but elegant home on Lawrence Street, transitioning from the queen of the underworld to a mysterious, wealthy widow of high society. However, the fire in her hadn't completely dimmed. In her 70s, she could still be seen walking the streets of Denver, carrying a gold-headed cane that many suspected concealed a sword. She became a living legend, a relic of a time when the West was a place of brutal freedom. Reporters would often try to get her to spill the secrets of the old days, the names of the politicians who had frequented her house, the truth about the gunfights, the locations of buried loot. Mattie would simply smile, a cold, knowing curve of the lips, and say, "A lady never tells, and a queen never forgets." As the years pressed on, Mattie found herself increasingly out of place in the 1920s. The flappers with their bobbed hair and short skirts seemed flimsy to her. They hadn't fought for their freedom. They had inherited it. They didn't know what it was like to ride through a blizzard to save a business, or to face down a lynch mob with nothing but a derringer and a stare. In her final days, Mattie began to give her money away. She donated to orphanages, to hospitals, and secretly, to the fallen women who were still struggling in the back alleys of the city. She wanted to ensure that no girl would ever have to choose between starvation and a man's cruelty if she could help it. On a cold January morning in 1929, Mattie Silks lay in her bed, the winter light reflecting off a small, silver-framed photograph of Court Thompson on her nightstand. She looked out the window at the Rocky Mountains, the jagged peaks covered in a shroud of white. They were the only things that hadn't changed since she arrived in 1876. They were the silent witnesses to her rise, her reign, and her quiet exit. She took a final sip of water, adjusted her lace pillow, and closed her eyes. She didn't dream of the house of mirrors or the gold she had amassed. She dreamed of the trail, the dusty, endless trail from Indiana, the smell of the prairie grass, and the feeling of the wind on her face when the whole world was still wide open and anything, absolutely anything, was possible. When the nurses found her, they said she looked at peace. But those who knew the legend of Mattie Silks noticed a small, defiant detail. Under her pillow, she had tucked a single nickel-plated playing card, the Queen of Diamonds. The funeral was one of the largest in Denver's history, not because the elite wanted to honor her, but because the city itself realized that with Mattie Silks, the last breath of the Old West had finally escaped. She was buried next to Court Thompson under a simple stone that didn't mention her profession or her wealth. It only had her name and the years of her life. But if you go to Denver today and walk down Market Street on a quiet, foggy night, some say you can still hear the faint tinkling of a piano and the rustle of silk. They say that if you look closely at the old brick buildings, you might catch a glimpse of a woman with a regal stride and a revolver in her garter, watching over the city she helped build from the mud, the queen who refused to be forgotten. The story of Mattie Silks remains a cornerstone of Western history because it challenges the tropes of the era. She wasn't a victim, and she wasn't a villain. She was a woman who realized that in a world designed by men, for men, she had to play the game better than they did. She turned the soiled dove archetype into a business empire, proved that a woman could be a tycoon in the harshest of environments, and maintained her dignity in a profession that sought to strip it away. Her house of mirrors stands no longer, but the legend of the woman who held the reflection of an entire era in her glass remains. She was the West, beautiful, brutal, shimmering, and ultimately unconquerable.